Okay, great. Okay, hi, David. We're really excited to have you here, and I'm really excited to be able to talk with you today and kind of, find out more about you and your insights and your writing. So thank you for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's a great way to spend the morning, or it might be afternoon. I'm not sure which, but
I haven't been outside, so I'm not,
yeah, it's time
I can't
doesn't
help.
mean what it used to be. Yeah,
Yeah, absolutely. Well, actually, I wanted to actually get right in with a sort of a personal experience.
sure.
So I read your book, The Black Panther Party, a graphic novel history, which has just come out this year, I
Mhm.
believe. And I really actually had a personal reaction because I grew up in the Bay Area. And I grew up in the Bay Area in the 80s and the 90s. And so much of what I learned about the Black Panthers was sort of through this lens of mourning and
Mhm.
of sorrow and regret. And just even though I didn't have personal experience, it was about, people thinking about the promise of what could have been. I remember when Huey Newton died. I remember, and everybody had very personal stories, some personal story about the Black Panthers, like all the people who had been there. My grandfather was almost a Black Panther, and he was a family man, and his mother and my grandmother came and got him and said, "You can't be doing this. You have 5 children." And so there's this whole thing about him. And I remember being told that what you saw about the Black Panthers on TV wasn't necessarily true, and that nobody talked about the community programs and the school children's programs. So I definitely had a very personal reactions to it, and I was really glad to have that full story to kind of help fill out what I had known personally versus the history that I had known. And I was wondering, kind of what was your personal experience with activism, growing up and during that time? Like, what about your personal experience led you to want to tell this story?
Well, it's interesting because I grew up in the 70s and 80s, and so you would hear stuff about the Panthers, and maybe once in a while you'd see a picture or an article in Ebony or Jet magazine in your grandparents' house or something like that. So I kind of knew who they were, but I didn't know that much about them. And then into the 80s, there was certain hip hop groups like Public Enemy would be talking about them, and so that sparked some interest. It seemed like everything that you heard or saw was this sort of, I guess, for lack of a better term, almost like propaganda. So they existed really as this myth in my childhood, almost like the Black Panthers were a bad thing to be.
Mhm.
And you had mentioned the death of Huey Newton, and I remember hearing on the radio the day he died, and like newspapers started having these stories about him, and I think there was even something on CNN, and I was just out of high school, maybe a year or two into college when he died, and it was just sort of like, you know, the media was making such a big deal about his death that it was like, how come I don't know more about this guy? Was the sort of thing that was running through my head at the time. And then maybe within a year of that, I had, I actually went out and I bought Bobby Seale's book on the history of the Panthers and actually started reading up on them because I was curious. And then I remember, like, a year or two later, I found out about Fred Hampton, who had been the Illinois Panther Party chairman, who'd been murdered by the Chicago Police Department. And I remember thinking, like, how is it that I don't know about this guy? Like, I was already alive when he was murdered. I was only like a year old or something, but technically this is all stuff that had happened within my lifetime, and I was really kind of upset. And we'll say I was like 20 when all of this was happening, and it just got me to thinking about, like, how much history isn't told, how much history we don't learn, or when we're told it, it's sort of one-sided. And again, I was 20, 21 years old, and just you're angry at that age. You're still coming out of your teen rage years, and that was sort of what got me to thinking, this would be an interesting story to tell. And but I never necessarily thought I was going to be the one to tell it. I just was sort of waiting around for somebody else to do it. Um, if you wait long enough, at some point, I guess you have to do it yourself if you don't get what you want, and that's part of how it all came to be.
Mm. Yeah. You know, it's interesting right now that, you know, your book has come out, and, you know, there's the movie Judas and the Black Messiah that's come out. And I wonder, like, some people are saying sort of there's like a moment, like a Black Panther's moment. And I don't know if I would say that exactly, but what do you think about the story is so relevant right now?
Well, there's a couple things. One is that everything that the Panthers were, everything they stood for, and everything they dealt with, and we're talking 50 years ago, it's still relevant today. Like everything that's happening right now in this country was happening 50 years ago in terms of things like police brutality and poverty and the inequality that we are still dealing with. And when we look at the history of the Panthers and we look at the history of America leading up to that time when the Panthers formed, what we see is that not nearly enough has changed, right? And so I think that that's part one of why there's this interest right now. And I think that the other part of this interest is pretty significant in that, you know, here, like I said, I was born in 68. The Panthers were formed in 66. And I'm part of a generation that absolutely should have known basically from birth who the Panthers were. And I didn't know. And so that really bothered me. But I think that there's a younger generation right now that that rage is even more prevalent to them because it's more immediate to their day-to-day life. It's like, you know, I see all these younger folks that are part of the Black Lives Matter movement, and they are who I was, say, 25, 30 years ago when I was first really studying who the Panthers were. And because of the way information comes out, a lot of these people are like, "Yo, wait a sec, what is this? How come I didn't know about this? How come I don't know about?" You know, I just told somebody the other day. I said, you know, you realize that the most restrictive gun control laws in this country were passed to disarm the Panthers. The Panthers, you know, exercised their Second Amendment right to bear arms, and in order to get the guns out of their hands, the California state legislature passed laws that were as restrictive as any laws passed. And people are like, "What? I didn't know that." And it's like, yeah, well, see, this is how much you don't know. and and it's never to throw it in somebody's face, because I didn't know, you know, and there's still stuff that I don't know. But I ever since I was young, I was that person who got really irritated when I found out that there was something that I felt like, you know, we should be getting taught this in school. I got in a lot of trouble like when I was in high school, junior high and high school, because I would argue a lot with the teachers. So I guess I was the life I'm living now. I was meant to
Mhm.
to live, to be a contrarian and a storyteller.
You know, it's interesting that you would be talking about sort of this connecting to young people today, because one thing I noticed with the reaction to sort of the initial stills and trailer for Judas and the Black Messiah, something that definitely came through with your book too, was how young
Yeah.
the young men and women who were Panthers were, how very young. And I do feel that's something that comes through in your book. And was that deliberate? And kind of why were you trying to make that point, if
Oh
so?
yeah, it was definitely deliberate, but it was there's almost like there's two types of deliberate. There's the you're fact checking and you're going, okay, Bobby Hutton was 16 and Huey Newton was, you know, 20 whatever, and you know, Fred Hampton was 19 when he joined the party. There's that fact checking, and you're just getting it straight, right? Um, and but then there's that moment where you go, well, wait a second, I'm old enough to be the dad of all these people right now. You know, how do I think about that? What do I, you know, how do I feel? And you know, what would you mentioned your grandfather, right? You know, what would I say if I was Bobby Hutton's dad and he was 16 and he was like, you know, I want to carry a 12 gauge shotgun and go patrol the streets. And, you know, when I was 16 or 17, I'd probably be one of those, you know, young kids who wanted to pick up a gun and go out there and lay his life on the line. But when you're 16, and even when you're 20, 21, 22, um, I don't think most of us really get what that means. And 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 I think even today there's a lot of young people that don't get what that means. And there's this idealism and I call it the fire in the belly to make the world a better place. But you don't necessarily realize that, like, some folks will kill you before they'll let the world become a better place. And the Panthers found that out the hard way. Um, and I feel like when people ask me, my opinion about where they went wrong or what happened or why the party fell apart the way it did, and it's like there's so many factors involved, but part of it was just that they were young, and that the party could never have formed with older people, um, or it couldn't have formed the way it did. But it also, you know, I don't know how it could have survived, given that time frame and their age, and also the I guess you could say demographic, forming in Oakland in '66 the way they did. All the founding, Bobby and Huey were the two founding members, and then there was 5 or 6 other people that came on board. All of them were born in the South, and their families had migrated to Oakland during the '40s, during the Great Migration, to work in the shipyards. And there was this hope and this dream of a better life that was away from the Jim Crow South, that was in the northern cities or the western cities, and that way of life wasn't there. It was a dream that didn't exist. And so I think that there was a very special type of young Black person in that sort of came up in these cities, that realized there was no escape. And it's kind of difficult to articulate it, but it was, there's a difference between, say a 17 or 18-year-old Black kid who was born and raised in New York, versus that 17 or 18-year-old Black kid whose family was from Mississippi and left Mississippi and came to New York hoping that things would be better, and then things weren't better, and their eyes are open in a different way. And all the founding members of the Panthers, I think, I know for a fact they were all part of this generation of, there's nowhere left to run. We can't go back south. We're about as far north as we can go, unless we go into Canada. And when I think about that sort of stuff, I had a friend of mine call me the other day. Their daughter just turned 18, and she is like the activist on fire, right? Just like ready to burn everything down. And mom and dad were kind of freaking out and fighting with her, and I kind of had to have that talk. And I said, okay, I just want you to stop for a minute and remember what you were like when you were 18, and how, you, even at our age, we still tend to think in terms of good and bad, right and wrong. But when you're 18, when you're 16, when you're 15, there's far less nuance to those concepts. And I think that's what it's what a bunch of young people in the Bay Area were dealing with in '66.
Mhm. Wow, I really like that. Just tying that to the Great Migration like that, and
Yeah.
just the ways in which also that maybe even their expectations
Oh yeah.
were
Yeah.
higher, because yeah, this is the promised land. I know that, like a lot of people, my grandparents came out of Arkansas, and that's definitely how they saw it,
Yep.
coming to
Yeah.
town.
And my grandparents came out of rural Virginia, and and they had their view of things. And then my dad and his brothers and his sister, they were all born in northeastern United States. um, and so they were aware of the difference between the North and the South in very stark contrast. Summertime, they would go spend the summer with Grandma Lizzie, right? And they'd go back down to Virginia. And the difference between rural Virginia and New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, where the family migrated to, especially in the '40s and '50s, was like drastic, and I definitely, within my own family, I see there's a level of cynicism that developed within that generation. I think they're the boomers, right? They're probably baby boomers, but I always get messed up when we're delineating the different generations.
Mhm. We often have these conversations in my household because, I'm Black and my husband is white Ashkenazi, and we talk a lot about sort of the stories of two survivors.
Hmm.
that story. And I especially lean into the Great Migration story as being kind of analogous to that, coming across in steerage story, where it's not dissimilar. You're going to try to find a new life and a new way to live out your identity in
Mhm.
peace. And then you come up, you come up against reality. And in some ways you come up against America.
Yeah.
Having those two identities yourself, is that something that you discussed growing up or thought about growing up?
Oh, I thought about growing up. I never discussed it because, these were the things you didn't talk about in those days. My cousin, his daughters are, they have the luxury of being biracial. I always tell them that, right? Like that wasn't a term we threw around when I was that term didn't exist when I was a kid growing up in the 70s. It was like, you know, like I was a zebra and I was an Oreo cookie and I remember, because I grew up in a predominantly white community, and there was this one kid at my elementary school who he was mixed, but he could pass, right? Like you would never know he was black, and he never owned it. He never admitted it, right? And to the extent that he would like push me away, like he did not want to be friends with me, a sort of guilt by association. And so I grew up very much feeling like an outsider, not quite fitting in. Within my family, the black folks within my family, most of them were very accepting, and some of the people in the community were very accepting. But the moment I went outside my neighborhood, it was difficult, and so I just held a lot of stuff inside, and I didn't know how to process things, and um, the sort of microaggressions that you deal with as you're growing up. Like I just tell people I was raised on a steady diet of it, and after a while it forms like almost like a blockage, like you're constipated and filled with all this anger and hostility. And now I see a younger generation, and things are so much different for them, but it's also not different, right? I see them not quite knowing where to fit in or how to fit in because in part we believe so much of what mass media and popular entertainment tells us we're supposed to be. And when you're again, we'll say biracial, if you're biracial, there's not a lot to see, right? When I was a kid growing up, the representations of black folks on TV were slim to none, and those that existed were terrible, right?
Mm.
And now I don't see too much that speaks to my particular experience, or I'm sure some of the stuff that your kids go through, or any other kids who are, um, you know, biracial or multiracial, whatever you want to call that. It's We're still like in a society that underrepresents a lot of people. Like we're even more underrepresented, and if you grow up in a sort of, I want to say like an environment where there's not a lot of people like you, or not a lot of people that you can fully relate to, or not a lot of people that fully accept you, it's easy to think that you're going crazy, or maybe you're the only one who thinks this way. And and then you get a little bit older, and now with the internet it makes it a little bit easier, right? But I'll never forget the first time I met another light-skinned negro who talked like a white person, and I was like, there's another one, because like in my family, I'm not even the lightest person in my family, but um there's definitely people that had that way of talking. There was just like that extra special sauce in the voice with the way they talked, and they came from the South. And so you knew they finna to get up in your face, right? And I didn't have that, right? So it was the worst feeling. And the moment I met somebody else, the moment I met somebody who said, oh yeah, when I was growing up, I was too black for the white kids and too white for the black kids, or I no one would date me, it like I was like, oh my god, like there's other people are going through that. And I don't know if I don't think that that's as prevalent as it used to be. Although maybe it is, because I'm not growing up now. Well, I'm still growing up, but
Right. Yeah, I'm actually, I wonder about that, because sort of what is your advice to kids who are growing up right now, and young people who are growing up right now who don't see their stories and their experience represented? Like, how do they get to tell their own story?
Oh, you just, well, that's the thing. And I'll say it'll sound flippant and easier said than done, but just tell the story, right? That's the thing. It's um, because no one's going to no. First off, no one's going to be able to tell your story, right? No one's going to be able to tell my story. They might tell a story that's similar that we can relate to in one capacity or another, but your story is yours to tell, and and I think I think that there's some person, maybe they're still in their teens, maybe they're in their early 20s, who had a similar background to me growing up, but they're younger than I am. They're 30 years younger than I am, 25 years younger than I am, and they're going to hit the nail on the head and tell the story that I wish I could have told, right? That I still wish I could tell. um and but the it's interesting because as much as America has trouble dealing with um, the issues of race and racism, we also have so much difficulty in dealing with the nuances of discrimination and prejudice, and even the stuff that will happen within the Black community. So there's, you know, aspects of skin color and hair and all that sort of stuff, the way we talk. And then when you throw in the fact that, like, oh, oh, your mom is white, and then that's this whole other thing too, right? Um, and so I just tell people, because I teach part-time at Portland State University, and I lecture and I do workshops, and I just tell young people, like, just work on telling your story, work on getting it out there, because it's if it's relevant to you, if it matters to you, if there's truth coming from what you're telling, it's other people are going to connect with it. It's going to resonate with them. Not everybody has the ability to tell a story in a way that draws people in, that elicits empathy. And so if you have that skill, that power, that ability, it's like with Spider-Man. With great power comes great responsibility. You have to use that to help other people. And as a storyteller, I told this to my students earlier in the semester. I said, story exists for people to understand the life that they live, and for them to escape from the reality that they're in. And and that's a tremendous amount of responsibility on the storyteller. And where do we go to escape, right? Where do we go to feel better, to heal ourselves? And the thing we have to understand is that our healing is in the telling of the story. We're not going to get You don't get the same thing, or I shouldn't say the same thing, but it's different. Musicians listen to music differently. Writers read differently. Filmmakers watch movies differently. We internalize and we process, and it resonates with us in a different way. And part of the way it resonates with us is that, oh, we have to do it too. There's other people that are just content reading their books, and they have their other gifts that they give to the world. Um, and it can be a gift and it can be a curse too, but it's what we make with it. And I feel that, at the very least, I think every single person wants to know that they're not the only one who's feeling crazy, right? They're not the only one who, um and it's difficult when you're, and I always say, the only one. When you're, if you're the only girl in a school full of boys, you're going to feel like an outcast. If you're the only Asian in a school full of Black kids, you're going to feel like an outsider. There's always some sort of outsider status. And um and the truth is everybody's an outsider, right? Nobody totally fits in. And those that do give up a certain amount of their identity to fit in, right? That's part of it. So I think that might have been a long-winded answer. I'm sorry.
Well, that's really great. You know what you're making me think of in terms of outsider stories? Comics and graphic novels for so long have been one of the places where people with outsider stories express themselves and tell their stories, from, Stan Lee, Art Spiegelman. What about this medium do you think speaks to people?
Well, and it's a very interesting and complex question. And the answer is equally interesting and complex. One of the things that a lot of people don't understand about the comics medium as a whole, as it was formed here in the United States, is that it was a medium formed primarily by Jewish folks and the children of Jewish immigrants, right? We're talking about a time in the 20s and 30s where anti-Semitism was rampant, and Jews weren't white people. That's the thing in the decades past. When Italians came over from Italy, they weren't white. When Irish came over, they weren't white. When Jews came over, they weren't white. They were what they were. And then over time, there was some levels of acceptance. So there wasn't a lot of opportunities for Jews in the world of commercial illustration, um, and in journalism and things like that. And so they gravitated towards this developing industry of comics. And so you Will Eisner, who's one of the kings of of this medium, uh, him, Stanley, who was born Stanley Lieber, Jack Kirby, who was Jacob Kurtzberg. You talk about Art Spiegelman. A lot of the pioneers of this medium were already outsiders, right? They were outsiders who were looking to be accepted. When you look at Superman, I mean, Superman is the story of the Jewish experience in America. It's really the story of the immigrant experience, right? Which is you come from another land, you have some sort of great power, some sort of great gift to offer the world, but you also have to keep it a secret because people will be scared of it, and you're looking to be accepted. I mean, like the Superman is the ultimate immigrant story, but then when you realize that here was a character who was created by two teenagers who were Jewish, who were the sons of they were first generation born in America immigrants, right? And so I think that's part of that outsider mentality. Even if you look at, say, Black folks who broke into the comics industry starting in the 40s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, like they were outsiders too, right? And there was this sort of there to a certain extent there was some camaraderie within the industry. And then of course, and this is a thing nobody ever talks about, it was an industry run by gangsters, right? So it was in that it was part of the newspaper newsstand industry, and the newsstand industry was controlled by the primarily by the Jewish mafia, right? So again, all of these sort of outsider influences and underground economy and all these things that really are part of the American story, part of the story of the outsider, but we tend to poo-poo on them. Um, it all went into the comics industry, right? So you'd have a guy who was, an artist, writer, working on a comic strip, who was a first generation Jew, whose brother was a mobster, whose mother like was a nurse, whatever. And I think that even though we don't see that much within the creators now, it's it permeated the industry. It was always a refuge for people who didn't fit in, and because it's all about illusion and it's all about creating visuals. There were women who found a place in the industry when women couldn't find a place in any other industry, and because the person who was picking up a newspaper or picking up a comic book and reading the comics never knew what the person who made it looked like, right? Nobody knew what Charles Schultz, who did Peanuts, looked like. Was he tall? Was he short? Was he, where was he from? What was his true background? Schultz, what kind of name is that? So um, I think that the comics was born out of a need to expression and to pay bills and first to survive, but it was also this refuge that it became a refuge for a while, and since then it's changed. I mean, every industry, every form of entertainment, it hits a certain level. Hip hop did the same thing, where it was created by a very particular group of people, then it attained mainstream popularity, and now it's whatever it is. It's this multi-billion-dollar thing. Comic books are the same way. If you would if you had told me when I was a kid that the entire mythology, there'd be an entire generation raised on a mythology of movies, that were going to make billions of dollars at the box office, I wouldn't have believed you. You know, I mean, the best we had growing up was the Incredible Hulk TV show, and that wasn't that good. So
Do you feel like something is lost when that happens?
there's always something lost, but if we're lucky, sometimes there's something gained, right? And I think that comes down to the individual more than it does to society. It's um, when things get, say, lost to history. We were talking about the Black Panther Party and sort of this resurgence or this rediscovery that they're having. I remember before Spike Lee's movie about the life of Malcolm X came out, there wasn't a lot of people who knew who Malcolm X was. He had sort of, drifted into the sort of, he was drifting into the lane of historical obscurity. And it was a sort of thing that, you kind of knew. That was a test of somebody's blackness, actually, when I was a kid growing up. Had you read the autobiography of Malcolm X yet? And then the movie came out, and suddenly people were reevaluating him. They were discovering him, and with that discovery, there were certain things that were, I don't want to say lost, but it was suddenly like, oh, Malcolm X isn't mine anymore. He's he was an inspiration to me. Now he's an inspiration to all these people. These people over here are afraid of him, but like the secret is out. And I think that it's sort of the same way. It's like when I was a kid growing up, if you read comic books, you were like a nerd, and not in a good way. You'd get into a fight on the playground or whatever, and most nerds got beat up because they just weren't proficient in kicking ass. So but now it's like, I'll go to a convention, or I'll meet people, and sometimes I'll see someone I went to high school with, and they're like, oh man, I loved comics when I was in high school, and they've got their kid with them, and I'm like, bro, you're lying, because you don't remember that time we got into the fight in the cafeteria because I was wearing a Hulk t-shirt and you called me a nerd. So don't tell me. And it's interesting that to see that level of acceptance, and it's pretty cool. For me, the most frustrating part is like, if someone goes to see, say, one of the Marvel movies or something, Black Panther or Avengers or something, and they enjoy the movie, but they don't go back and read any of the comics. Like, to me, that's the big problem. It's like, okay, the acceptance is great. Like, if you watch Judas and the Black Messiah, and you now sort of know who Fred Hampton was, or if you pick up my book and read my book and have some understanding of the Black Panthers, and it stops right there, that's where I feel the problem is. Like aren't we all, I think we all have an obligation to learn as much as we can, and or to be entertained by more than just one thing.
Mhm. I wonder, it almost, and I'm maybe having difficulty pulling the thread together in that way, but it almost feels parallel to like an assimilation
Mhm.
narrative in some ways, when you talk about sort of this industry that was at first very much about outsiders and is now about, $1 trillion,
Yeah.
industry.
Yeah, no, and it's interesting too, because the comics industry, as it is, it's still pretty much an outsider sort of industry. It can be difficult to break into. It feeds something bigger, right? And so in that regard, it's almost like high school basketball, right? High school basketball feeds the NBA, and that's where there's millions and billions of dollars to be made. Um, and comics feed film, and so there's billions of dollars to be made in film, and then there's like chump change to be made in the comic book world. Um, and I just, as someone who loves to read, I just feel like reading is a lost art for a lot of people, and that there's so much more that you can get out of it. So I tend to champion, the graphic novel and reading a little bit more than maybe some other people would.
Mhm. Are there any trends in kind of in graphic novels, or new ways of pushing the medium that are exciting you right now?
Yeah, there is actually. I was just reading the other day. I never can remember creators' names, but the person who does the Dogman books for Scholastic, the new Dogman book came out. And these are meant for younger readers. And like in the first week, they sold like 250,000 copies, right? And so the Dogman books, he puts out about one a year. One Dogman book will outsell the entire mainstream comic book industry, right? Like Marvel Comics can't sell 1 million units, period. Which, when you tell people that, they get kind of surprised and shocked. So there's this move towards um, an almost, it seems like a separate industry in and of itself. It's catering to a younger audience. There's like a middle school audience, and then there's pre-middle school, and then there's a young adult audience. We're seeing stories that aren't necessarily surrounding or centered on superheroes. There's all kinds of different genres, because superheroes are a genre within the medium of comics. um, and for myself, I'm working in nonfiction, telling historical stories. So it's growing and evolving, but it's also splintering in ways. And I'm hoping that at some point, some of this stuff can come together in a more cohesive way. But yeah, I just had a conversation with an editor recently about young adult stuff, and I was asked if I was interested in writing something, and I said, sure. And then I looked. I got a bunch of books from the library, picked up a couple at the local bookstore, and I was like, wow, this is a completely different world than what I'm writing for. It's part of it's just the construction of, how many scenes, how many pages to a scene, how many pages to a scene, how many panels to a page, how many words to a word balloon, the technical side of it. But I was looking at this one book that was like, well, the Dogman book, I was looking at it and I was like this book is like, you could do this in a week. That's what I'm thinking, right? It's not really that, but I see it as being, and that's never to diminish the work of other people, because I know how much hard work it is, but it looks so different than the sort of work that I'm used to doing. And and since I exist in the world of graphic novels and comic books, I understand that the workflow is different. I have a deadline. I'm late on a deadline for one of the comics that I write that will be out in June. And then simultaneously, I'm working on something that the script isn't due until 2023, and the book isn't coming out till 2025. So it'll kind of give you an idea of how, part of my head is I actually have stuff on my calendar for 2023, 2024, and 2025, which is just kind of freaks you out after a while.
Are you able to share anything about your next projects that are in the pipeline?
Well, I've got no, I can't. Well, yes, I can. I'm working on another nonfiction book it's going to be slightly different in the presentation, but it is another nonfiction dealing with an aspect of Black history and the Black experience in America. And then I'm working on a really big graphic novel that I wish I could talk about, because it's awesome. But that's the one that won't be out till 2025. But it's the book that will, everyone should write it down now. It's the book that everyone will either love me for or absolutely hate me for. There'll be no middle ground. um, and then I'm working on some smaller, more personal projects. I'm working on a story right now that I'll likely self-publish, and it's very autobiographical, and it's about the creative process, and it's about what it means to grow older and sort of lose your inner child, the one that feeds your imagination, and what it means to sort of run away from the creativity that helped develop you. And so what I've done is I've taken this comic book character that I created when I was 13, and I wrote all these absolutely terrible stories. They were what a 13-year-old would write. Um, and I'm sort of redoing those stories and then blending them into um, a story about a creator and his creation, and them trying to come to a compromise, because the character wants an end to his story, and the writer artist guy is like, yeah, I don't have any interest in telling your story, and it gets into this what I call the responsibility of creativity as well as creative well-being. And that's something I'm just going to put out there. And the working title of that is right now, this week, the working title is the all new adventures of Recklaw the Ravager. And because that was the name of my character, which Recklaw is Walker spelled backwards, because that seemed so clever when I was 13. And he's basically just this guy from outer space who runs around killing everybody, because I thought that was so cool. And he's got revenge on his mind, and I look at that stuff, and while I should be ashamed of it and I should be embarrassed by it, and I know a lot of people who would be, like, yeah, I wouldn't be where I am today if it wasn't for that stuff, right? And there's part of me that wishes I had that creative abandon that I came up with it, that was like, what would be cool is if I made a guy who was purple who, has a sword for an arm, and, um, and so that's like become my passion project more than anything, because I don't know how to do it. I don't know quite how the story is going to unfold, and how to compose it and put it together. So every day is like me. It's like I'm a mad scientist. It's almost like Dr. Frankenstein trying to build the perfect monster, and I'm getting there. I'm getting there. The first, it's going to be told in a series of short chapters, and the first chapter hopefully will be done, if not this month, sometime in May. And um, and for me, as an instructor as well, I'm always telling my students, you have to get to the truth. You have to tell the story that you want to tell, the story of who you are. And this is my story. This is the most truthful story I've ever told, which is why it's so hard to tell, because it's like, okay, I don't want to mess this one up, because it also gets into um, that sort of sense of alienation that I had growing up, because I was that kid who would rather spend time in his bedroom drawing his own comics than being around other people, because I didn't feel like I fit in. And so here I am, this kid who didn't fit in, writing this character who doesn't fit in a world that, and so it's going to be pretty meta, but I'm looking forward to one of the artists sent me some pages the other day, and I was like just giddy over it.
Wow. That's really great. I really look forward to getting the opportunity to check this out, as well as your top secret projects. Especially from it really says a lot when you're talking about being a young person trying to express yourself, and coming back and looking at it now, but realizing that, isn't it great that you tried?
Yeah.
Because a lot of times when we're talking to young people about storytelling, about the creative process, and about like sharing their identities, a lot of times they're kind of like, they look at their favorite writer, or they look at their favorite, graphic novel, and they're like, I could never do that, so I'm not gonna,
Yeah.
and how do you help them have the confidence to just do it and just try?
It's funny, because the one thing I tell my students is, like, you're never going to find any semblance of success in whatever it is that you want to do if you don't do it. You won't find success until you stumble over failure, and failure is not failure as long as you learn from that process. And so that's part of what this story is about, because I spent my entire youth and into my 20s starting projects and never finishing them, starting them and never finishing. There comes a point where it's difficult, and you don't know what to do next, and you're not sure, and you just quit, because it's easier to quit and start over again, right? And that's part of what this Recklaw story is about. And it's about a creator who quit when he was a kid, gave up on this character, and now the character's back saying, look, I need my story. I need my story to be told. And what begins to happen as the story unfolds is that you realize that the creator, the person who's supposed to be me, there's aspects of his life that he needs to get on with, and he's not able to. And so they form this relationship, and it's very lowbrow in its approach, but it's also I'm having so much fun writing it, and it's almost like therapy. I wrote some stuff last night, and I was just like, where did this come from? And I was feeling really good about it. And it's in a lot of ways, it's me exercising whatever, you could call my demons or my hangups. And I was talking to some friends, and I said, yeah, no, this is me healing my inner child. This is me like getting back to the basics of who I am, what I am, and showing people the importance of what I call creative well-being. And we all have our forms of creativity. It doesn't have to be writing or music or painting. It could be anything. It could be gardening. It could be whatever. But if we don't answer to that creativity, if we don't answer to that thing that reinvigorates our spirit, then we're just slowly dying. We're slowly withering, and that's the worst thing that we can do. If we're fortunate enough to be gifted with whatever skills or passions, and we don't do something with them, then like it's squander. It's like being given a puppy dog and letting it starve to death. Oh, I like that. I'm gonna have to write that one down.
I was just about to say that actually seems like a wonderful way
Yeah.
for us to end and to leave it there. That's, yeah, that imagery for sure. Yeah. Well, I really appreciate you talking to me today and
Yeah.
sharing your insights and your creative process and learning all about history of Medium.
Yeah.
So, yeah, thank you.
Thank you. This was really fun. And the one thing I reiterate this again. Everybody has a story to tell. You have to figure out a way to tell it, and your story will connect with other people, and they won't be people sometimes they'll be complete strangers. That's part of why we're here, right? Is to form these human connections, and to realize um that we're all kind of the same monster, I guess.
Yeah, I love that. Okay, well, thank you so much, David.
Thank you.
Okay, take care.